Okay. Hi, Ron. Welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast.
Hello, Josh. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat today.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, just to be really candid, I guess, with everybody, is this is our second recording. The first one didn't go so well, but the conversation was great, but the recording itself was struggling with some glitches. So I really appreciate you coming back and doing this with me again. And I'm actually really I think at the end of our conversation last time, we said, hey, this is the kind of conversation for each of us that could go on and on for hours. So in a sense, I'm glad that we get this chance to reconnect and do this again.
Yeah, the feeling is mutual. It's a rare opportunity to have a first podcast with someone you've already connected with, right? And kind of establish some base. So excited to dive
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, absolutely. So just before we started recording when we were still offline, you were talking a little bit or just wondering a little bit more about my background. And I actually think that's a good place for us to start for both of us. Um, and we'll kind of build up to the stuff that you've produced and then kind of what you're doing now, both with the book but also with SpiritDAO, and
Mhm.
uh and maybe diving into a little bit about our backgrounds will help kind of set some context for why we're both so interested in such strange topics, or I guess such esoteric topics. So yeah, tell me, Ron, just tell me a little bit about your upbringing and your the environment that kind of shaped you, and then maybe um just what when was it that you started noticing that you had an interest in some of these kind of bigger human level topics, um and where do you think that came from? So and if you're willing to do that, then I'll do the same, and then we'll kind of start from there.
Perfect, Josh. Well, I appreciate that inquiry, and I'll just provide some context for the people watching at home. So, I'm the author of a book titled, or the original author, I should say, and I'll get more into what that means in a bit. But of a book titled "Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis," which develops new frameworks of meaning and value informed by cosmology and physics, ideally kind of binding spiritual renaissance to systemic reformation. So, in terms of my background and how I've kind of found my journey on like the spirituality path. I was raised in the Northeast in pretty traditional, like middle class household. But my dad was a very blue collar worker, HVAC guy. Mother was like a property manager at flea markets when those were a thing, and now kind of still property manages, but very like lower middle class upbringing. Raised as a Roman Catholic, so I went through the whole process. Went through, we call it CCD. It's like Catholic school. Got confirmed, right, which is in the Roman Catholic Church is when you're an adult in the church's eyes. And I always joke, but essentially, I made my first adult decision when I was confirmed, which was never to go back. So I found that the Roman Catholic narrative failed to resonate from a young age, and it was just very difficult to kind of find meaning in there. Of course, there was some wisdom in the traditions, but ultimately, um, especially in the context of like a Roman Catholic upbringing, there was a lot of dogma, a lot of, I think, otherness and kind of how the framing of what it was good and true. And so, my journey to kind of fast forward into professional life for quite some time, I was kind of like spiritually agnostic. It just wasn't really relevant to my life, and I did a lot of my late teens, early 20s, a lot of self-improvement reading and work in that kind of direction, just kind of discovering my own kind of pathways. And um, I ended up, so I got into, I was a founder of a Web 2 company in my early 20s, and I was CEO for 8 years. We ended up getting acquired. It was a niche business about brewing your own beer and wine. But we scaled up pretty quick. And the point I'm referencing this because after 8 years, like a CEO of a for-profit like startup, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. It was not at all motivating. Although it was a fun job in terms of like we were brewing beer and I really liked beer at the time. I was a big craft beer guy. Ultimately, I transitioned after the exit to nonprofit and social impact work, which is where I spent like the last decade of my career. But during my time as a CEO, I got pretty heavily engaged in local organizing and activism in the state of New Jersey, which is my home state. So I've done a lot of environmental organizing. I've done organizing around the minimum wage. So I was actually instrumental in getting New Jersey's $15 minimum wage passed in 2018. I was recognized by the governor in 2019. I've done a lot of just small kind of canvassing operations for a variety of projects, labor rights. I've run for political office. So essentially, I've kind of gone through this process of like, okay, I want to make change. So it started on like a really grassroots level. Then I tried to enter in a more establishment level through a political candidacy. But all the while, I kind of came to the conclusion that all of our vehicles for change resisted by design. So they're not intended to, I would say that American democracy and the laws governing our relationships in the American democracy create impasse by design. They're designed to kind of stall progress. So ultimately, after a lot of research, I fell deep into a philosophical rabbit hole under the philosopher Roberto Mangueira Unger. He's a Brazilian philosopher. I think he's teaching at Harvard presently. Um, but easily spent hundreds of hours in his work. It's massively extensive. Then I got into like physics of Lee Smolin, Roger Penrose, read more than a handful of their books. And ultimately, I kind of came to this conclusion that like our greatest struggle with transcendence, and I mean that both on an interpersonal level, but also on a collective level, was not that we have all these problems, but really that we've lacked viable alternatives. So you have all these struggles, but all of the struggle, the way that you're guided to make the change is through the institutions that are responsible for the struggle itself, which was how I kind of set out on this path of like, how do we create an alternative? What does an alternative even look like? And hence why I'm a big advocate and one of the few, I think, in the meta-modern spirituality space who's so fervent about binding a spiritual project to a systemic project. I believe that our moral and material interests are inseparable. Um, but that's kind of how I found myself here. So I'll pause because obviously I love to chat and this gets me excited, but I'll kind of pause on how I found myself to this journey. So, the book was like a 6-year journey, 3 years of research, 3 years of writing every day for a year. And then it's been about 2 years since it's been released. And I've just been kind of promoting it and working on SpiritDAO. But I'll pause, Josh, because as you mentioned, we were talking, and I would love to better understand your historical background with spirituality and how that kind of influences your perspective on the conversation we're going to have.
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate you sharing all that. It's interesting. I always am curious the path people take to get to where they are. And then particularly when somebody's passionate about something. So what got them to that point and why are they passionate about it? Um, so yeah, my own background, I've shared this a number of times or some of these details on the podcast a number of times. And but really, really quickly, I come from a family that is, it was a large family. We had 7 kids.
Wow.
I would say that we were on the lower end of the, financial, there were times that we required assistance from like the church and help like that. And we just, yeah, we just lived a very simple life as far as finances went. But, we were the religion that I was raised in, which obviously would have affected me, my idea of spirituality. But when I look back on it, it like definitely wasn't the biggest influence of spirituality in my life. Um, but I was raised in the LDS church or the Mormon church.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really interesting actually. Just reading a lot about the Catholic Church, comparing the systems and the symbols and the rituals and everything to the Mormon faith and the Mormon system. That alone is a topic that I think is really interesting, because and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole necessarily, but the Mormon Church is it's designed to be taken extremely literally
Mm-hmm.
to the point where there's not a lot of strong symbology. Meaning, like, if you go to an LDS church building, it's as plain as possible. It's like
Mm.
there's not a lot of decorative features. There's very little art. Like they might have some art in the hallways, but the hallways are very simple. They're made to be used and be, the walls are carpeted so that they're not like damaged, so that there's the lower half of the wall, I guess. So anyways, compare that to any Catholic building that you walk into, a cathedral, a church, anything. It's just so grand and ornate and just imagery and symbology. And it's like a very different experience, where in Catholicism, it's almost like you are supposed to go into this other space. It like feels like you're immersing yourself in the symbols when you go to church. And with the LDS church, it's very different. It's like, no, this is what we do every day. It's very literal. And so there's very few symbols. Anyways, that's a topic we can dive into. But I find that very interesting. So yeah, I grew up in this religion, in it's kind of an impoverished setting. And then my family, the thing that I think probably gave me some kind of like spiritual bent, or really got me interested in like kind of this inner realm of like psychology slash spirituality, was actually just growing up in the countryside. And we were homeschooled, and so my days were just, as a child, like I just spent my days outside by myself, basically in nature, in the wilderness. Not necessarily the wilderness, but like it was like country, rural farm area. And yeah, I didn't realize how much that was impacting me as a kid until I grew up, and I stepped outside of my religion of birth, my family's religion, and then I started explore spirituality from a different perspective. And as I explored different frameworks of because I lost my religion as an adult, and so and sorry to be long-winded about this, but
No, it's fine.
I lost my religion, or my faith, as an adult. And it was just, I had been raised in this silo, homeschooled. Basically, like we just prayed and read scriptures every day. We prayed multiple times in this kind of like closed, siloed environment. And the messages were all very, you know, they kept you, it's a religion. And so it's like a patterned to keep you engaged, patterned to keep you
Hmm.
inside. So I grew up with this architecture of, hey, this is how I see reality because this is how it was described to me. And as an adult, I came to question first just like feel in my body that it wasn't true as a reality, and then I began to explore it more from like an intellectual perspective, so history and records and things like that. And leaving my religion, what ended up happening was that I experienced kind of a collapse of that framework for what all this is and what I'm doing and what existence is and my purpose and meaning. And so I just went into this stage of life, I guess, where I just wanted to consume everything I could, from science, physics, chemistry, biology, evolution, and then all the way to, like I got onto the psychology bent. And really it was when I came across Carl Jung where I finally came across a framework that I was like comfortable with, in just the experience that I have with life. And in a sense, if you think about physics, right now we have a framework that works really, really good, or really, really well, from that came from us to us from Einstein. But then we also know that it doesn't fit perfectly to it. It'll never fit. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where we perfectly fit a map to the reality of the universe. As far as we're still trying to figure out quantum mechanics and all of this. In a similar vein, or in a similar sense, I think from a spiritual or psychological perspective, we're just trying to come up with models and trying to understand the situation from a model. And it seemed to me that the work of Carl Jung probably most closely aligned with his model, most closely aligns with how I experience reality from a conscious, unconscious perspective. And it just really gives me a lot of tools to explain what I'm experiencing, but then also understand what's happening with other people and as a collective. And so, long story short, I was raised in a very religious environment. And when I lost that environment, I just needed something to help me understand. And as I got into more and more of wanting to understand all this, I just got more and more interested in talking with people like you who are also, questioning these things and trying to put it all together.
Yeah, so several kind of threads we could pull on because I think that's very interesting. And I appreciate you sharing that. I know, as you mentioned, you've shared a bunch, but I imagine it's no less vulnerable each time, right? That's a very interesting history. And it's fascinating too, because as someone who's kind of been in the meta-modern spirituality space for some time, I find that like many people are either in your shoes, which is like this super strict, kind of deeply religious, obedience-oriented kind of faith framing of faith. And then the kind of other half is like people like me who lost faith at an early age or never really had it, but kind of were okay navigating. But as we kind of grew into ourselves and started questioning purpose and value and like what we were working towards in the world, kind of fell into the intersections of it. So you had mentioned just kind of a couple of quick threads, right? You had mentioned the church. So you're absolutely right. The Catholic Church, right? I think in alignment with like the Vatican, these buildings are to some extent works of arts, to some extent I think kind of monuments to obedience and otherness. So I think there is it's no different. I think that style of architecture, that massive style of arcs, and the ceilings are super high and just everything's gorgeous. It's no different than a medieval castle, right? Like a Vitoire castle, right? The idea is this awe and splendor, and um and obviously a feeling of smallness, right? So I think perhaps that's ideal, perhaps not in the context of God. I would say no. I would lean towards the opposite. But I think that's a very historical, especially in the context of the salvation narratives, very historical kind of framing of divinity is our smallness. I would say a large part of the book is about our bigness, right? Our shared not only vision of bigness, but our alignment with the divine. Um, and I had a third point, but I kind of forgot it. But I appreciate just that kind of context of where it comes from. And I think ultimately, like when we think, I want to emphasize to like you and the viewers is like ultimately my argument, while the book is fairly critical of let's say like the inherited religious context, it's not a critique on any one individual. I think one thing about your story that resonates deeply with me is most of us in the context of our spirituality inherit it, right? It's not like it's an active choice we make. And I think most of the people in the world still kind of are on that direction. So it's like you inherit this spirituality and either you embrace it and it becomes part of your life as an adult, or you kind of forget about it, but you may not. Maybe you return to it like when someone dies or whatever, but it's not like an active kind of source of thought. But when I think about the world today, like I would make the argument that all religions serve kind of like three core purposes, right? Which is to deal with um, groundlessness, like what's the point, right? Or doubt is another. Like I use simpler language in the book, doubt, but like why are we here? What are we doing? Insatiability, right? The idea that what we do is never enough, and it's like there's always this need for more, or desire is another way of framing it. And then death, right? Death being like, I think, one of the core components. And I think the challenge with the inherited context, the inherited narratives, is like they fail to meet the needs of the moment, right? Ultimately, and it was something where we kind of concluded, it's one thing that sticks out to me from our last conversation, is we kind of concluded with the statement that we have to conceptualize religions as not only spiritual technologies but also political technologies, right? So they all kind of bear this. I would say all systems, but especially religions, bear the imprint of their moment of creation in kind of two distinct directions, right? The purpose of the system itself, which the moment it begins being used, any system starts to deviate from its purpose because users never do what the system is supposed to do. Um, but also in the values embodied by its creator, right? And I think part of the challenge with the historical narratives of spirituality and why there's such a conflict in the modern day is these were designed by Bronze and Iron Age peoples, right? Just very different human time experiences, very different value sets. And there's no amount of like selective hypocrisy that can diminish the more oppressive, the more dominating components of these spiritual tenets because they're at the core of what they are and what made them be what they are today. So I think the desire for an alternative is very strong, but it's kind of like we don't know where to really look and kind of go after. So just some random threads, but I thought it was interesting just in the context of what you were sharing.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that you talk about inherited systems because I think you're absolutely right. The systems that we've inherited today, the ones that seem to no longer fit They don't really fit the framework of the world. Like they don't fit the reality of the world, but they also don't fit the just the experience of who we are today. So like you said, that these are myths or symbols, these are systems that were created in the Bronze Age, literally thousands of years ago, and have kind of evolved or perpetuated forward. And the reality of the situation is that this has just been the process over and over and over, where culture like biology is this entity that wants to keep evolving and keep growing. So just like you mentioned, this as soon as a system's put in place, it starts behaving in a way that it wasn't intended for. And that's because it follows all entities that come about, all they somehow, you can think of them as living beings, living creatures. And as soon as something is alive, the number one imperative is to survive. And so these systems get created as a survival mechanism for a specific group of people at a specific time. And it works. And that's the beauty of these systems. It works in that time and space. And the reason that we know it works is because it's still influencing us today. But the challenge is that the world has changed. And so this evolution of the culture, what it does is it changes the environment so that all the individuals can start changing. And then once all the individuals have changed, they've literally outgrown the ideas because they now need to move on to the next ones. And this is why it's really interesting that you're thinking about all these things, because I truly believe that this is where we are in history, is that the symbols, like Carl Jung would describe it as like we've lost connection with the symbols. And that's because we've all grown up in comparison to the story that people were living at that time. And it is time for a new story.
Yeah, yeah, well said, and I agree. And I think there's kind of two distinct threads we can pull on. So it kind of goes back to your point about like Einstein's physics, right? I would say that much of our challenge is goes deeper back. It's like really Newtonian physics, right? Newtonian physics was this vision of a static universe, right? We have these unchanging laws that govern the nature of reality, gravity, right? The apple falling from the tree. And what we now know in our immediate present is that nothing about the history of the universe has ever not been changing, right? I make the argument that change is a single truth in the book. It's a provocative argument. The intention is that there are two types of truth. There's subjective truth, lived experience, right, which is real and accurate, kind of, because we kind of inherit the moment, but also objective truth, which is like shared measurement. But we now know that our objective truths evolve over time based on our scope of knowledge, our scope of technology, et cetera. But when you talk about like the revision of narratives in the spiritual context, this is something that has been done in the past, right? Like it's well evidenced, for example, in Judaism, that the spirituality evolved from a polytheistic kind of regional religion to a monotheistic religion. And it's well documented when that evolved, right? Like that is in their scriptures of when they chose to change. I think one of the challenges in the moment is, when we talk about doubt, desire, and death, is the greatest kind of crisis around that is our dogmas surrounding the three. It's that we prefer to live in a reality, or many people would prefer to live in a reality that, represents what our dogmas prefer reality to be, as opposed to what it actually is, right? The nature of being as it is, which is this, in terms of physics and cosmology, this ever-present now. Here we are, right? The quantum wave state collapses upon itself. We find ourselves observing, sharing experience. So as part of the larger challenge is that we've kind of embodied a lot of our spiritual philosophies into our ego, and that goes with that inheritance process, right? It's from my family's Catholic, my family's this, my friends, right? It's how I associate an identity in the world. And that kind of, I think, in many ways really stifles our capacity to meet the needs of the moment. And at the same time, kind of fix this in this place where there's a large sect of people who would ultimately rather resist the change and just kind of allow, there is a non-zero number of people in the US, some of whom are close to political power, who are fundamentalist Christians, right? Who believe in rapture, and that this is actually what we're bringing upon ourselves in the immediate present, with the Holy War presently taking place in Jerusalem and Palestine, right? So Israel and Palestine, excuse me. So the idea being that like this is we have these deeply dogmatic beliefs about faith that were constructed thousands of years ago that are influencing the policy decisions of the day, right? So I think that's like kind of the component, and without an alternative orientation, without a deeper kind of construction of value and meaning, right? Because I would argue at the heart of the meta crisis, polycrisis, et cetera, is our frameworks of meaning and value, because that informs the how, right? There's a lot of people in the space that believe that coordination is the primary challenge. I'd say no. Our coordination capacity is informed by our values, how I embody the world, how I embody like what was right and good, and that creates a genuine challenge, kind of transcending the crisis when there's such distinct dogmatic sects that frankly prioritize like domination as a means of self-preservation. So I'll kind of pause for a moment there.
Yeah. Well, I kind of want to dive in a little bit deeper into the actual book and some of the contents there. And so you brought up this idea of dogmas and people. Essentially, what you're talking about is like people who are so ingrained in their ideas that they don't even know that they're ideas. They think that they are reality. And when you have that as a situation, it's always, trust me from my own life, that upbringing that I explained, like people in my life, like when people are entrenched in their ideas, their dogmas, you yeah, it's very difficult to have a conversation with them. So that's one challenge. That is one challenge. Is that when you say the crisis, is the crisis like an inability to see the problem? Or when you say, or when you talk about the crisis, is the crisis actually the problem? And is it like this long list of things that we understand as far as like the environment and the economy and government? What is the crisis?
Yeah, all of the above, right? So the meta crisis refers to all of the existential threats, kind of threatening our collective well-being, in addition to the frameworks of meaning and value, which help us sense make in the world, right? So I think it's like we have a foundation that's crumbling, and we're trying to kind of sense make, and in addition to that, we have in many ways kind of not given our so I think a large part of the crisis is we've constructed systems, right? So you mentioned, the crisis we could dive into. I give a practical analysis of the meta crisis in the book, and it's like I focus on obviously the environmental crisis is like the biggest one, the most existential threat that we haven't, we've kind of made our bed, but we haven't really laid in it yet. I don't really think we understand like the depth of what's going to happen now, whether or not that's man-made or a polar shift. I'm not a climate scientist, although I tend to lean more on the fact that our efforts probably have influenced it to a great degree. But also elected misrepresentation, the billionaire God King, right? I don't believe that we can be free in a society of class and caste. I think that is antithetical to human freedom, especially a deep freedom. But it is the global order of the day. So it's a very difficult kind of leap to kind of overcome, especially because, to be candid, like doing this work, doing movement work of any kind in the nonprofit space, you're perpetually under-resourced. You're perpetually like begging for money from people who have it, who've in many cases gotten it through ill-gotten gains, right? Like, so it's a very, it's a larger kind of systemic problem. But yeah, the meta crisis, to wrap this up, the meta crisis is all of the problems plus our conceptualization of the world to kind of deal with them. You mentioned it, and I actually think it's like true in almost a practically literal sense, in that like our beliefs really do shape reality in the most literal sense. Now, what happens is when you have a large group of individuals directing focus and energy in a specific direction, right? It's an act of becoming. But the problem is, of course, is like you have to coalesce one reality with many different ones. So I think for those individuals you're talking about who are extremely dogmatic, that is reality, right? It is the nature of reality. The question is, do they possess the courage? Do they possess the restraint, of their own kind of dogmas to seek alternatives? Because I think there are many alternative views. The universe is trying to kind of coalesce itself around a vision that aligns with its. There's people arguing the universe has intrinsic values. I don't know that I would go that far, but it's possible, right? We could say love would easily be one. That probably makes the most sense. But yeah, I'm happy to kind of dive in. I've already kind of started to some extent with the crisis, but if you want to dive into I can kind of give a brief overview of the central kind of theories and philosophy behind self-actualization in the age of crisis. Is that of interest to you? Do you want to kind of go down that route?
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a thought about just this. We talk when just that we were talking about this in a sense that one of the biggest challenges is that people, you call it their story, their ideas, their dogmas, whatever it is, it gets wrapped up with their identity, and then so one of the biggest challenges that we face is people not being able to see fully what the challenges are because their reality is shaped by their belief system. And so the only thing I wanted to say about that is that it's really easy to point to the Christian conservative far right, that side of the spectrum, of the polarity, and say, okay, they're very dogmatic and they're fixed in their ways because there's a specific religion to point to. The only thing I would say to kind of balance that is to say that I actually believe that both sides are under the same spell. They're just worshiping a different ideology, or they're just locked into a different set of beliefs. So the way that I conceptualize it is that it's actually about growing up. And so you use the phrase self-actualization, and I really do want to get into the tenets around that you want to that you've got in the book. So there's this idea of self-actualization. Another way for me that I conceptualize that is I say all these different ideas are synonyms: self-actualization, growth, maturing, healing, growing up. Carl Jung would call it individuating. I would consider all of these at some level synonymous. And so what happens is if you try to grow up and you you get captured by, see, when you're a child, you need somebody to take care of you. And when you grow up, essentially you should achieve a state where you take care of yourself. In religion, it's very easy to see how this idea of like there's a God in the universe who's in charge of everything. And at some level, you can take that need that you have on your parents and you can transfer that to a God. And so the universe, at least somebody in the universe, is in charge and taking care of things. And then from the left, the more kind of political left, what we would call liberals or Democrats, much more likely to fall in line with like science, and less likely to fall in line with a God. But on the extremes, you see the same behavior where they're looking for something to substitute a parent, and all they do is they put science in that place. They put government in that place. And so yeah, I guess this is a bigger, I'm just trying to kind of balance the scales a little bit and say this is a bigger challenge than just religious folks, because the religious instinct can attach to a lot of things. And I actually see this big spectrum both on the right and the left of people who need to kind of grow up and mature and take more responsibility for themselves. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges, right? Is just that people have transferred this want to be nourished, to be cared for from a parent to some other entity. And so then from there, the process then, if it's a polarity, the process, whether you're on the right or the left, is to pull yourself towards the middle for some kind of like healing, growth, maturation. Anyways, this is just
No,
me
that's
rambling
so
now.
good. So good, because I have like
Yeah.
so many things we're gonna postpone the book a little bit more because I have so many threads to pull out. So first and
Okay.
foremost, I appreciate your clarification because I want to emphasize to you is that is my intent is not to pick on one group. First and foremost, it's nothing about people. I want to emphasize that was kind of my component about the inheritance thing. It's like I'm not critiquing anyone for any religious beliefs because more often than not, that was an inheritance, and in the path that you chose it, well, good for you. Even my kind of argument in the book is like the single truth requires no believers. The infinite nature of material reality doesn't require us to believe it for it to be accurate, right? But so it's less about that. I also want to emphasize that while the salvation narratives, to your point, are an easy target, there's critiques of Buddhism, Confucianism, and other like religious philosophies in the text as well, because all of them essentially fail to meet the needs of the moment when it comes to addressing doubt, desire, and death. None of them do a good enough job to kind of conceptualize the world as we see it today. And your point about, I really appreciate the context of like the parental relationship, because I think it emphasizes it's not just religions, it's economics, it's politics. To your point, we've given our creations power over us, right? We've naturalized them in some sense. For example, like our dogmatic approach to economics, we have a single market maximalist approach. There's only one type of market, but nothing about the history of U.S. laws says we can't have multiple markets working in tandem, right? So there's a lot of experimentalism that we kind of diminish through a dogmatic approach to systems. And in doing that, again, we've given our power to these systems, our creations, but they don't deserve that power. Like they're not enough for us, and they'll never be enough for us. I think it's a core kind of component when we think about self-actualization. Like the central theory that we've kind of put forth in the book is that the nature of the universe is this infinite perpetual change. That's the root nature, right? Whether you say it's consciousness, whether you say it's energy, it's this root, it's just this permanent transmutation of states. And given that is the physical material nature of reality, that gives us a context about how we should view values, how we should view structure and system, and how we should organize ourselves. Because today the challenge is we have, again, static institutions that are trying to adapt to an ever-evolving world, and they can't. It's not part of their very structure at its root cause, because that would diminish their entire purpose, whether it be the legitimacy of the government, the legitimacy of a certain spiritual orientation to kind of accept a more rapid pace to change. So I just want to emphasize to you, and I appreciate the clarification, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm picking on any individual followers or any groups, because it's not, that's not, A, it's not helpful. But also I want to emphasize one kind of small counterpoint, right? Your argument towards the center, I would kind of push back on that. I think I think oftentimes the center is kind of conflated with like a layer of neutrality, right? Like it's like, oh, I can embrace all points of view. And I would disagree. I think that there's no such thing as neutrality in the world, right? Every decision we make points us in a specific direction. Whether I make it independently or I make it collectively with a group, we're transforming the world to a specific shape in that direction. So I think that there's, you know, I don't know that a retreat to center is ideal, because in, let's say, both sides of the extremes, you would have groups that want to diminish the rights of other groups. And how can that be? How can you, if I'm and let's bring it back to the fundamentalist Christian, just as a low-hanging fruit of like example. If I believe that women should not be able to cross state lines to get medical care for a pregnancy, how do you negotiate with that? How do you say, how do you form a context for negotiation where half the population doesn't have a right to escape, doesn't have a right to their own medical, this is kind of where we get into like blurry lines with neutrality. So I'm not sure that's what you're referring to, but I just want to kind of share that perspective, in that I think we have to be really careful with this idea that there is a middle ground. There's a direction. We have to choose a direction. Right. There's no escaping that.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Like, I don't think that I was necessarily talking about neutrality. I think maybe all I was doing is visualizing, a continuum.
Sure.
It's like a bell curve. And I have these two extremes, and maybe don't think of it from a political perspective. It's like a maturation perspective, where if you're a balanced person, you're kind of in the middle of that curve. If you get too imbalanced, you start relying on things like God. You start relying on abstract things. If you go this way, you start relying too much on things that are like, government, social structures, whatever it may be. So I think all I was saying, as far as coming to the middle, was not letting yourself be swayed too far. It's just more of a visual thing. But I agree with you from a practical perspective. Yeah, you have to come up with a value. You have to have values, and you have to have some kind of actionable philosophy around those values, and then yeah, you have to make a decision and act according to that. And so there's not going to be neutrality is like, just like Jesus said, if it's not warm, hot or cold, if you're just warm, I'll spit you out.
Well, a perfect segue then into an alternative. So the alternative in the book, and I'll kind of keep it very high level of everyone, I'm sure you'll share the links, but the book is available for free. And I do want to emphasize to the community that, SpiritDAO, which you briefly mentioned in the introduction, is a community that's kind of formed around the book, but it's more of a meta-modern spirituality community. So although it is architected around self-actualization in the age of crisis, it is intended to evolve. So I want to be clear about that. I also mentioned I'm the original author because quite some time ago, I signed over the rights to the book, to the DAO. So the community owns the book. They've actually collectively edited it already. And all of the profit the book has ever made has gone to the community. So I haven't made a penny off the book. I think that's, from my personal perspective, deeply integrated into kind of the philosophy and practice of the alternative is not to make it just some venture where I make a bunch of money selling books, right? So anyway, the context that is kind of presented in the book is the chapter 0, which I call the time and the divinity of the moment, which kind of architects some core kind of components of reality. Essentially, we now know that cosmology and physics tell us and are increasingly telling us that the nature of material reality is in fact infinite, right? So in the book, I specifically base it off of the idea that we've observed radiation in the cosmic microwave background that's older than the universe. So we see radiation through our observations that is older than the entire universe. So either all of our estimates of the universe's age are wrong. That's possible, right? But there is a great consensus around that. So I said, okay, if there's such a strong consensus, perhaps then there must be another logical alternative, which is that if we observe something older than the universe, there's had to be something there prior to the universe to leave that radiation, right? So then we develop a theory that there's essentially infinite sequential universes. So there's one universe at a time. This is not multiverse theory where there's like all these universes at once, which is, I imagine, probable, but it's actually like you can't test it. It's all mathematical theory, so there's nothing to actually observe. So I say let's ground ourselves in our observations. So we have this observation. We live in one of many sequential universes. The idea that there was a universe prior to ours, there'll be one after ours, right? There's this one now. And for that to be accurate, it emphasizes a couple of things. The first thing it emphasizes is what I would argue is the single truth, right? If the material nature of reality is in fact infinite, then we know change to be the defining commonality amongst both our subjective and objective experiences. Change is not meant to be change being the single truth is not meant to be a war on syntax. I don't really care if people say this is true. What they really mean is, oh, this is accurate in the moment. Like I can observe this thing. But we now know, and science as a whole has turned towards the idea that nothing about our objective observations should be universalized, right? Just because we observe something here doesn't mean it applies everywhere else in the universe. It shouldn't be static. We shouldn't assume that it will always be accurate because, for example, the laws of gravity, the laws of strong and weak nuclear forces, these things have evolved over time. We now know through our study of the Planck epoch, which is that moment directly after the Big Bang, right? The universe exists as a single universal superheated whole. As it begins to cool, the laws governing the nature of reality as we experience them today start to take form. But the key takeaway is that they evolved. Right. So if they evolved in the past, it is possible that they could evolve again or in alternative directions. Now,
or that we're right in the middle of them evolving. We're right in the
exactly.
middle of the process.
And our lifespan and our observation powers are so infinitely small compared to the nature of the universe that it could be happening through our eyes, but might take millions of years and etc. So it may just be beyond our capacity. And I think that's a core component of like our philosophy is there's an aspect of the universe that is what it is. Right. I think a large challenge with kind of embracing a meta-modern spiritual alternative is that the idea is like, I think too often we confuse our desire to make sense of the world with the idea that everything we observe must make sense. And that's not accurate, right? Like it doesn't have to make sense just because we observe it. I think it's especially in the context of the just scale of the universe. So the single truth is not enough, in my opinion, to base a unique or like an alternative spiritual philosophy. So then we bind it to the relational universe. Now, the relational universe is like Vedic and Hindu, to some extent Buddhist philosophy. The idea that things like consciousness, things like values, these arise out of relations. So the relational process is both one of the observer and the observed, right? So I write in the book that all of us are observers in an informational universe. And it's, the information without the observer is mute. The observer without the information is void, right? They don't exist separately. They only exist in tandem. And that unity kind of provides a context for divinity. So I would make the argument that there are in a single truth, a relational universe governed by the single truth, there are two observable infinities. And this is how we kind of draw divinity. Because you had mentioned before about like the monotheistic trend to posit God as like this governing being, right? It's above us, it is dictating, it is interfering. I argue that no, like the observable infinities are the universe itself and human imagination. And the alignment of those two within a moment represents divinity. It's when we're most godlike, right? When we create, when we bring the new into the real, that is the greatest expression of our godliness, our divinity in the moment. And therefore, as a spiritual kind of context, if you orient yourself around these things, then you do one of two things. You embrace it for yourself, which we'll talk about practices and philosophies, how to do that. But also you recognize that you have a responsibility to elevate the other, to most actively express the observable infinities. Because I would make the argument that today, much of the human population is unable to, primarily through policy design, right? They're stuck in cycles of sustenance. My entire life is to feed myself and my family. There's no hope for like individual actualization, etc. From there, we redefine the self. If we recognize that we are inseparable from the happenings of the universe, right? You and I, two independent individuals, two unique conscious coordinates at the same time, a single happening. Right now, experiencing a self from two different rooms, in two different houses, in two different areas of the planet at the same time. So from there, we redefine self to more accurately represent the relationship between an individual and their circumstances within a given moment. Because our ability to act, our access and agency is perpetually bound to the circumstances we find ourselves in. Right. And it's like, oh, this almost addresses the free will problem. Free will is like not something I concern myself with because the answer is the same either way. It's always your ability to act is always in relation to the moment you inherit. Like, what am I surrounded by? So whether or not I have free will, my options are always going to be the same. And so does it matter? I don't know. And so this kind of grounds the spiritual grounding for how do we form a context of divinity, of spirituality, that is nature-based, right? So this is, in many ways, Terence McKenna, the ethnobotanist, biologist, I think he's a botanist, talked about an archaic revival. And I think in many ways what we're presenting here is exactly that. It's a return to nature. The difference is, as opposed to, let's say, indigenous wisdom, which is like an earth place-based nature, this is a cosmic nature. This is an understanding of the true depth of our connection with the entirety of the whole, the universe itself. Just some fun facts, right? Like the universe itself has more in common with a human brain mathematically in terms of its structure than it does any individual galaxy. The same thing is true for the brain. The brain has more in common with the universe than it does any individual neuron in terms of the mathematical structure of those connections. So there's some really fascinating kind of overlaps. Then we find ourselves kind of in this changing nature of time, right? Our experience right now, you and I are great examples. I don't know your age exactly, right? But I was born in the 80s, right? Mid 80s. So it's like I've experienced a childhood of like no tech into like Nintendo and then Super Nintendo and like high tech. And I had a computer when I was 12. I was writing code at 14, right? I just turned 40. So it's like I'm at this kind of like this transition state of like I had the everything from nothing to kind of see it evolve. And fortunately, I've been positioned where I've been like well adapted to it, right? But I feel like for the millennial kind of generation, it's a really unique experience to understand the changing nature of time. That is to say, is that as our information processes and as our access to information becomes compounded and we have more and more within less and less moments, our capacity to act is greater within any individual moment. We can do more with the moments now than we ever have before, assuming you have the access and agency, right? So I'll go over the next stuff high level and then I'll pause because obviously I do get excited talking about it, but I'll kind of, we break it down into the idea of the self, right? Redefining self. Then we break down self-actualization to more accurately represent individual actualization, which is the development of I, and systemic actualization, which is the development of we. And in the individual actualization chapter, I write about a number of things, but one thing I develop is a new framework of core values to align us with the infinite nature of reality. Those values are easily remembered as reframe courage, and the values are relation, equity, flexibility, restraint, awareness, minimalism, enthusiasm, and courage. And we can pull on any of those threads if it's of interest. And then I have a chapter on systemic actualization, which is how do we organize the systems to accurately reflect these values in the nature of reality, these self-changing systems. and develop a suite of rights I title the Eight Dignities, which are a suite of essentially human rights that we would leverage and build as global public works. The key component is to unbind rights from the state. I think it goes back to your previous component of like your previous point about the parental relationship is like, oh, this kind of nanny state thing. And I agree, no one wants that. But at the same time, we had to, if we want to increase and empower a culture of experimentalism and imagination, which is like our greatest power, you have to have a greater social safety net. The price for failure today is so high to experiment. Speaking as someone who like founded a company and exited, like if I had failed, I would have been totally broke with nothing, etc. It's just an immense price for experimentalism, which I think is the total opposite direction we want to go in an age of AI and artificial intelligence, etc. So let me pause because I said a lot and I'm happy to dive deeper. Any threads you want to
Yeah.
kind of dive deeper into?
Yeah, absolutely. So much there that I relate to, so much that I connect with. And same, even to like I was born in 1985, so I turned 39 this year.
Mhm.
I literally grew up as a kid walking around Great Vineyards barefoot, and then ended up like, same as you, I went into the startup world. I founded a cybersecurity company or information security company. And then now here I am like exploring psychology and spirituality. It's a weird, weird existence. So yeah, I can relate to all of that. Yeah, I want to jump into a couple of things. So first is this idea that you have of the individual self-actualization or like at the individual level, but then you also have the systemic level. I think it's fascinating to think of it that way because of the way that you were talking about the human brain being more similar to the universe than to individual neurons. There's one of my favorite authors is Joseph Campbell. And
Mhm.
Joseph Campbell, he talks a lot about everybody knows his kind of like hero's journey work, but his real like maxim opus is this set of books called um uh what's it called? It's called the Masks of God. And so it's the
Mhm.
Masks of God. And what he does is he goes through the history of humanity and shows how God changes. And one of the big things he does in this book is he shows how early city states, early empires, early, nations, when people first started forming these big groups, they started mapping their societies, literally mapping them to the stars. And so
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
way that they would build their cities, the way that they scheduled their time, the way that they managed the calendar and everything, it's all mapped to the stars. And so Joseph Campbell talks about the stars as the macrocosm, the universe, it's like everything, the macro, and then us as individuals, we're the microcosm, and we're like these little. And I even think of, in my own personal mythology, this is how I think of us now as these little individual representations of the universe.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then in the middle, you get what Joseph Campbell calls the mesocosm. And so there is this literal mapping from the universe to the city state, and then all the way down to the individual. And so to think about psychology, I really do think about psychology as the individual behaves and functions and works exactly like the group, the larger scale, all the way up to the entire human species. So it makes sense to me that there should be a focus on the individual and there should be a focus on the whole or the system or the entity, the larger entity. And I honestly believe that the more just like you're saying, if you can create an environment where people have the ability to self-actualize, that's a good thing. Because the more people who self-actualize, the more likely it is that as a whole, as a human species, as like an entire entity, that we actualize. Um, okay, and then the second thing that I think this is actually something I've been thinking about all throughout this conversation. This idea that as humans, we really want to explain things and we really want to understand things. And so the first attempt at that was this type of archaic spirituality and religion. Those were actually attempts to understand, just like when the early astrologers were using actual astronomy to map the stars to their society, to their culture. They're trying to understand. And the thing with the religion aspect of it is that it wasn't a scientific approach. And so there was always like always this big question of like, but why or how, or, there's this like mystery about it. But in the modern world, what we do now to try to understand and to, you know, make sure that we have a grasp on our reality is that we follow the scientific process. And the scientific process gives us this like very specific type of information. And it's almost the instinct to understand is producing both of these things, religion and science. And so there's almost an impulse, especially from the scientific side, that wants to be so rational and process and systematic. There's this impulse from the scientific side to disregard and get rid of the religious side because it's not like a clear rational explanation. But I think what's happening in the modern world is what we're seeing is that science can't give us all the answers, but it can give us a lot of answers. And religion is an important part of who we are as a species, or at least that spiritual side of us. It's like coded into us. And so it really does feel like going forward, whatever this answer is of self-actualization, it's going to require both sides. It's going to require a lot of science, but it's also going to require the scientific, like even with the science, it's going to require us to accept that we're still humans and we have this huge spiritual unconscious, and we need to nourish it and pull from it. So I guess that's my long rambling, but yeah, I can really see where you're coming from in a lot of ways, and I can kind of start to put together, with these other ideas that I wrestle with myself, I could start to see how it may be that you are on a positive track.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And also a fan of Joseph Campbell, right? One of his like writings that always sticks out to me is like, to your point, the design of society around the movement of the planet against like a background of fixed stars, right? And I think little aside, right? But I happened to see a Starlink trail the other day, and I said, man, to myself, I'm like, imagine being like a 2000 BCE individual and seeing something like that. You would have thought the apocalypse was upon you, like to see these stars moving in a massive line. But to your point, I appreciate it. Obviously I strongly agree, given that that's the kind of argument I'm making, and I think in the context of your point about freeing the latent imagination that's trapped in the world, that is something that kind of keeps me up at night. And I think that's something that is a primary focus of why I'm doing this, right? Is I think there is an immense, you and I have like practiced gratitude, right? To be here having this kind of conversation in the comfort of our homes when so many people are kind of like really struggling in the world today, not only in the US, right, which has historically been a place of prosperity, but even today, what is it, like 60% of the population is living like paycheck to paycheck. I imagine that just gets like worse every month as people can't find jobs. But ultimately, it's like, if we're genuine about a transcendent kind of vision of humanity, to kind of connect that divinity, that spirituality, right? Because what is spirituality? That's another question, right? How would you define spirituality? I would define it based on the philosophies put forth as how at home the individual is in the universe. How at home are you in the world right now? Because that's the nature of reality now, right? The past is inaccessible. The future is unknown. So it's always about how at home are you in the immediate present? Are you stuck in a space of possible futures of imagining the negative? Are you acting in accordance with your capacity to align the observable infinities now to kind of create that vision of the new? And that is why I think when we think about like spiritual alternative, the necessity of binding it to a systemic project. There's a lot of people in like the meta-modern spirituality space, and everyone has their own vision, and that's like it is what it is. I think I am probably, to my own fault, not as persistent about conversion or forcing it down people's throats that maybe I should be in the idea of like a viable alternative, because ultimately I kind of wrote this book. This is the philosophy I embody. I know there's other people in our community at SpiritDAO who embody it, right? But I think the challenge is like many people in the meta-modern spirituality space are content with just like personal unfoldment work, personal integration work, and it's like it doesn't extend beyond the individual. And to my counterpoint is, what's the purpose? What is the value of doing that? How does that genuinely transform the world into a more sacred place? Because at the end of the day, for you to be able to do um, a multi-week meditation retreat, or you to be able to do a monastic, retreat for months, you have to exist in a certain space of privilege anyway. Like you have to have the access and agency to do that. You can't, a single mother of three who's working three jobs just to kind of keep the rent paid is unable to do that and is confined, through, by the way, this is the core component, right? Through economic and legal arrangements, through our choices. The reason she's impoverished is because we have a economic system that relies on a certain amount of unemployment. It relies on people unemployed to preserve a labor market, right? As opposed to what I write in my book is kind of a spinoff of modern monetary theory, which is the idea that you have both a public and private employment sectors that kind of fluctuate based on demand. So in times like today, where there'd be moderate, private demand, you would also have a moderate public demand where you could, funnel into all these public works projects. There is alternatives. I think the challenge is that we inherit an order, right? That is where the primary beneficiaries of the laws are also their architects, right? So they make the rules and they make them disproportionately benefit a certain class of people. And then it's like a cycle, right? Our political institutions are captured, which is like a core point of like, how do we bind a systemic project that is independent of any state? Because when you're bound to a state, you have political actors who can take away your rights. I live in the state of Florida presently, and they have actively removed medical access rights from LGBTQ people, right? This is like an active thing that's happening in the state now. And it's like, this is what I'm talking about. When you have rights bound to a state, you're trapped. So how do we kind of imagine an alternative where we have global rights? You have access to the most advanced resources, the most advanced process protocol, etc., for no other reason than being born, right? Because that child is a tongue-tied prophet. That child is divine, but they're vulnerable. They're extremely vulnerable. I have a almost 4-year-old, and it's like it's totally like reshaped my vision of just children and just that kind of relationship, because they're so vulnerable. But like, and birth lottery is such an outsized impact on their lives, and what a waste! What an absolute waste of all this latent genius and latent imagination. For what, right? To kind of keep entrenched powers into being. So that's I'm kind of like rambling a bit, but that's kind of like the whole like underlying theme of like, why is spiritual alternative necessary? It's necessary because the values, so full circle, right? And again, not to pick on one religion, but I think it bears saying that the monotheistic religions, which have a hierarchical vision of spirituality, a hierarchical vision of divinity, even the very notion of getting judged into heaven is a hierarchical concept of who will and will not be saved. They have the most outsized influence on our global organization. That is to say that the architects of global society, which was underway well before you and I were born, right? Well before. These were deeply religious people in monotheistic philosophies of divinity. So that's kind of how we're kind of in this problem, and why values and why a reorientation around spirituality is so necessary to kind of break free from it. And why SpiritDAO is a 501c3 church, right? It's like we can't deny the inheritance of the moment, but we can take advantage of the tax havens it provides us, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just think as far as the entirety of human history and the story and the evolution of it, we really are at a serious and important inflection point. We're not at the end of history, we're like right in the middle of it. And it's a point where we're going to have to figure out. First of all, I just think that the way that you're approaching it from a spiritual perspective is important, because it really is going to start with forming kind of a new story. It's going to be a blending of what's come before us and what we're discovering now. We're going to blend it into some kind of a new story, and it's going to need symbols that connect with our psyches. It's going to need some serious depth. And from that new story, we're going to start to pull these new values like you're talking about. Just like the stories that have come before us have provided us with the values that we enjoy now. If we had lived 2,000 years ago, like you and I, there are so many there's so many things that would just be so different, because the value set was different in terms of status, relationship, violence, all sorts of things. And so we've been blessed by those, but it's our job having gotten to this point, it is our responsibility to help evolve to the next stage. And it's going to require those stories and symbols. And then based on the values that come from them, it's going to require actual systems that are established in like a new way, in a new way of thinking with new types of goals. And yeah, we are over an hour, Ron, but I really think that so I guess I'm saying our time is up, but the the point we're at in history, I think that you are one of these people who, you know, from your perspective, for better or worse, from an individual, like whether or not it helps you enjoy life or you know get something out of life, but you get to be one of these people who is genuinely questioning this evolution, this constant change, and yeah, with this beautiful thing called the human imagination, we actually do get to architect it in some way if we're you know if we're conscientious about it. And so it's I'm glad that there are people out there doing this kind of thing. I'm glad that you know this type of it's important that you know call it even if you want to call it a negative, this privilege, like thank God, thank the universe, thank whatever that there are people who have had these types of privileges throughout history because they're the ones that shape the future for the better.
That's accurate, but it would be great if we had more people who could shape the future, right? Because
Yeah.
I am with you on that note, and
Yeah, and as you speak out against systems, as you like point out the ways that they control and manipulate people, I think that we are seeing more and more people wake up, and I think that is like a an encouraging part of modern, just this modern fervor that's going on. Is that the more I look around, the more I see people who are pretty aware of what's going on.
yeah, no, I mean, I think awareness is to your point growing. I think it's courage that we're lacking, and maybe an alternative, maybe just the knowledge of an alternative. And I think that's another big problem is that it's for most people the solutions lie within the very source of the problem. So you have to vote your way out of the problem. Yeah, well, that's not gonna they're not going to do anything. And I think it's also, and I know you want to wrap up. I just can't help myself sometimes. But it's you're the component about the question of like why can't the inherited philosophies be the change, right? Because there's a lot like a meta-modern Christianity movement, and of course the problem is that, as we mentioned in the very beginning, you kind of have to embrace the existing regimes of spirituality with like a selective hypocrisy. You have to choose what you like and push aside what you don't, but the challenge, of course, is there's no consensus. So there's no shared consensus about what is and is not pushed aside. So it just weakens its kind of core purpose. But Josh, either way, it has been a genuine pleasure. I do appreciate the time and the conversation. It was even better the second time. So happy we had the opportunity to connect. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, same. I feel the same way. Really appreciate it, Ron, and thank you so much. Bye.